Chapter 13 of The Adventures of Bindle by Herbert Jenkins. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 13 The Return of Charlie Dixon.
"Oh, Uncle Joe, Charlie's back, and he's going to take us out tonight, and I'm so happy."
Bindle regarded the flushed and radiant face of Millie Hearty, who had just rushed up to him and now stood holding on to his arm with both hands.
"I thought I should catch you as you were going home," she cried. "Uncle Joe, I think I want to cry."
"Well," remarked Bindle, "if you'll give your poor old uncle a chance to get a word in edgeways, 'e'd like to ask you why you wants to cry."
"Because I'm so happy," cried Millie, dancing along beside him, her hands still clasping his arm.
"I see," replied Bindle drily. "Still, it's a funny sort o' reason for wantin' to cry, Millikins," and he squeezed against his side the arm she had now slipped through his.
"You will come, Uncle Joe, won't you?" There was eager entreaty in her voice. "We shall be at Putney Bridge at 7."
"I'm afraid I can't to night, Millikins," replied Bindle. "I got a job on."
"Oh, Uncle Joe!"
The disappointment in Millie's voice was too obvious to need the confirmation of the sudden downward droop of the corners of her pretty mouth.
"You must come,"
and Bindle saw a hint of tears in the moisture that gathered in her eyes. He coughed and blew his nose vigorously before replying. "You young love birds won't miss me," he remarked rather lamely.
"But we shan't go unless you do,"
said Millie with an air of decision that was sweet to Bindle's ears.
"And I've been so looking forward to it. Oh, Uncle Joe, can't you really manage it just to please me?"
Bindle looked into the pleading face turned eagerly towards him, at the parted lips ready to smile or to pout their disappointment, and in a flash he realised the blank in his own life. "P'raps 'is Nibs might like to 'ave you all to 'imself for once," he suggested tentatively. "There ain't much chance with a gal for another cove when your Uncle Joe's about." Millie laughed.
"Why, it was Charlie who sent me to ask you, and to say if you couldn't come tonight we would put it off. Oh, do come, Uncle Joe. Charlie's going to take us to dinner at the Universal Café, and they've got a band, and oh, it will be lovely just having you two."
"Well," began Bindle, but discovering a slight huskiness in his voice, he coughed again loudly. "Seem to 'ave caught cold," he muttered, then added, "Of course I might be able to put that job orf."
"But don't you want to come, Uncle Joe?" asked Millie, anxiety in her voice.
"Want to come?" repeated Bindle. "Of course I want to come. But, well, I wanted to be sure you wasn't jest askin' me because you thought it 'ud please your ole uncle," he concluded somewhat lamely.
"Oh, Uncle Joe!" cried Millie. "How could you think anything so dreadful? Why, wasn't it you who gave me Charlie?"
Bindle looked curiously at her. He was always discovering in his niece naïve little touches that betokened the dawn of womanhood. "Ain't we becomin' a woman, Millikins?" he cried, whereat Millie blushed.
"Thank you so much for promising to come," she cried. "7 o'clock at Putney Bridge Station. Don't be late, and don't forget," she cried, and, with a nod and a smile, she was gone. Bindle watched her neat little figure as she tripped away. At the corner she turned and waved her hand to him, then disappeared. "Now I don't remember promising nothink," he muttered. "Ain't that jest Millikins all over, a twistin' 'er pore ole uncle round her little finger. Fancy 'Earty 'avin' a gal like that." He turned in the direction of Fenton Street. "It's like an old 'en 'avin' a canary. Funny place 'eaven," he remarked, shaking his head dolefully. "They may make marriages there, but they make bloomers as well." At 5 minutes to 7 Bindle was at Putney Bridge Station. "Makes me feel like £5 a week," he murmured, looking down at his well cut blue suit, terminating in patent boots, the result of his historical visit to Lord Windover's tailor. "A pair of yellow gloves and an 'ard 'at 'ud make a dook out of a drainman. 'Ullo, General!" he cried as Sergeant Charles Dixon entered the station with a more than ever radiant Millie clinging to his arm. "'Ere, steady now, young feller," cautioned Bindle as he hesitatingly extended his hand. "No pinchin'." Charlie Dixon laughed. The heartiness of his grip was notorious among his friends. "I'm far too glad to see you to want to hurt you, Uncle Joe," he said.
"Uncle Joe!" exclaimed Bindle in surprise. "Uncle Joe!"
"I told him to, Uncle Joe," explained Millie. "You see," she added with a wise air of possession, You belong to us both now."
"Wot o!" remarked Bindle. Gone, and cheap at 'alf the price. 'Ere, no you don't." By a dexterous dive he anticipated Charlie Dixon's movement towards the ticket window. A moment later he returned with 3 white tickets.
"Oh, Uncle Joe," cried Millie in awe, "you've booked first class."
"We're a first class party to night, ain't we, Charlie?" was Bindle's only comment. As the two lovers walked up the stairs leading to the up platform, Bindle found it difficult to recognise in Sergeant Charles Dixon the youth Millie had introduced to him 2 years previously at the cinema. "Wonder wot 'Earty thinks of 'im now," muttered Bindle. "Filled out, 'e 'as. Wonderful wot the army can do for a feller," he continued, regretfully thinking of the "various veins" that had debarred him from the life of a soldier. "Well, Millikins," he cried, as they stood waiting for the train, "and wot d'you think of 'is nibs?"
"I think he's lovely, Uncle Joe," said Millie, blushing and nestling closer to her lover.
"Not much chance for your old uncle now, eh?" There was a note of simulated regret in Bindle's voice.
"Oh, Uncle Joe,"
she cried, releasing Charlie Dixon's arm to clasp with both hands that of Bindle.
"Oh, Uncle Joe."
There was an entreaty in her look and distress in her voice.
"You don't think that, do you? Really?"
Bindle's reassurances were interrupted by the arrival of the train. Millie became very silent, as if awed by the unaccustomed splendour of travelling in a first class compartment with a first class ticket. She had with her the 2 heroes of her Valhalla, and, womanlike, she was content to worship in silence. As Bindle and Charlie Dixon discussed the war, she glanced from one to the other, then with a slight contraction of her eyes, she sighed her happiness. To Millie Hearty the world that evening had become transformed into a place of roses and of honey. If life held a thorn, she was not conscious of it. For her there was no yesterday, and there would be no tomorrow. "My, ain't we a little mouse!" cried Bindle as they passed down the moving stairway at Earl's Court.
"Oh, Uncle Joe, I'm so happy," she cried, giving his arm that affectionate squeeze with both her hands that never failed to thrill him. "Please go on talking to Charlie. I love to hear you and think."
"Now I wonder wot she's thinking about," Bindle muttered. "Right o, Millikins," he said aloud. "You got 2 young men to night, and you needn't be afraid of 'em scrappin'." As they entered the Universal Café with its brilliant lights and gaily chattering groups of diners, Millie caught her breath. To her it seemed a nirvana. Brought up in the narrow circle of Mr. Hearty's theological limitations, she saw in the long dining room a gilded palace of sin against which Mr. Hearty pronounced his anathemas. As they stood waiting for a vacant table, she gazed about her eagerly. How wonderful it would be to eat whilst a band was playing, and playing such music! It made her want to dance. Many glances of admiration were cast at the young girl who, with flushed cheeks and parted lips, was drinking in a scene which to them was as familiar as their own finger nails. When at last a table was obtained, due to the zeal of a susceptible young superintendent, and she heard Charlie Dixon order the 3 and 6-penny dinner for all, she seemed to have reached the pinnacle of wonder. But when Charlie Dixon demanded the wine list and ordered a bottle of No. 68, the pinnacle broke into 1,000 scintillating flashes of light. She was ignorant of the fact that Charlie was as blissfully unaware as she of what No. 68 was, and that he was praying fervently that it would prove to be something drinkable. Some wines were abominably sour.
"I've ordered the dinner. I suppose that'll do," he remarked with a man of the world air.
Millie smiled her acquiescence. Bindle, not to be outdone in savoir faire, picked up the menu and regarded it with wrinkled brow. "Well, Charlie," he remarked at length, "it's beyond me. I suppose it's all right, but it might be the German for cat and dog for all I know. I 'opes," he added anxiously, "there ain't none of them long white sticks with green tops what's always tryin' to kiss their tails. Them things does me."
"Asparagus!" cried Millie, proud of her knowledge. "I love it."
"I ain't nothink against it," said Bindle, recalling his experience at Oxford, "if they didn't expect you to suck it like a sugar stick. You wants a mouth as big as a dustbin if you're a goin' to catch the end." When the wine arrived, Charlie Dixon breathed a sigh of relief, as he recognised in its foam and amber an old friend with which he had become acquainted in France.
"Oh, what is it?"
cried Millie, clasping her hands in excitement. "Champagne," said Charlie Dixon.
"Oh, Charlie!"
cried Millie, gazing at her lover in proud wonder.
Isn't it most awfully expensive?"
Charlie Dixon laughed. Bindle looked at him quizzically. "Ain't 'e a knockout?" he cried. "Might be a dook a orderin' champagne as if it was lemonade, or a porth and a pen'worth."
"But ought I to drink it, Uncle Joe?"
questioned Millie doubtfully, looking at the bubbles rising through the amber liquid.
"If you wants to be temperance, you didn't ought to."
"I don't, Uncle Joe," interrupted Millie eagerly. "But father—"
"That ain't nothing to do with it," replied Bindle. "You're grown up now, Millikins, and you got to decide things for yourself."
And Millie Hearty drank champagne for the first time. When coffee arrived, Charlie Dixon, who had been singularly quiet during the meal, exploded his mine. It came about as the result of Bindle's enquiry as to how long his leave would last.
10 days, he replied, and I want—" he paused hesitatingly.
"Out with it, young feller," demanded Bindle. "Wot is it that you wants?"
"I want Millie to marry me before I go back."
The words came out with a rush. Millie looked at Charlie Dixon wide eyed with astonishment. Then, as she realised what it really was he asked, the blood flamed to her cheeks and she cast down her eyes.
"Oh, but I couldn't, Charlie. Father wouldn't let me, and—"
Bindle looked at Charlie Dixon.
"Millie, you will, won't you, dear?" said Charlie Dixon. "I've got to go back in 10 days, and—" "Oh, Charlie, I—" began Millie, then her voice broke.
"Look 'ere, you kids," broke in Bindle. "It ain't no good you two settin' a stutterin' there like a couple o' machine guns. You know right enough that you both want to get married, that you was made for each other, that you been lyin' awake o' nights wonderin' when you'd 'ave the pluck to tell each other so, and 'ere you are." He broke off. "Now look 'ere, Millikins, do you want to marry Charlie Dixon?" Millie's wide open eyes contracted into a smile.
"Yes, Uncle Joe, please," she answered demurely.
"Now, Charlie, do you want to marry Millikins?" demanded Bindle.
"Rather," responded
Charlie Dixon with alacrity. "Then wot you want to make all this bloomin' fuss about?" demanded Bindle.
"But it's so little time," protested Millie, blushing.
"So much the better," said Bindle practically. "You can't change your minds. You see, Millikins, if you wait too long, Charlie may meet someone he likes better, or you may see a cove wot takes your fancy more." The lovers exchanged glances and meaning smiles. "Oh yes, I understand all about that," said Bindle knowingly. "You're very clever, ain't you, you two kids? You know everythink there is to be known about weddin's and lovin' and all the rest of it. Now look 'ere, Millikins, are you goin' to send this 'ere boy back to France un'appy?"
"Oh, Uncle Joe!" quavered Millie.
"Well, you say you want to marry 'im and 'e wants to marry you. If you don't marry 'im before 'e goes back to the front, 'e'll be un'appy, won't you, Charlie?" "It'll be rotten," said Charlie Dixon with conviction. "There you are, Millikins. 'Ow's 'e going to beat the Kayser if 'e's miserable? Now it's up against you to beat the Kayser by marryin' Charlie Dixon. Are you going to do it, or are you not?" They both laughed. Bindle was irresistible to them. "It's a question of patriotism. If you can't buy war bonds, marry Charlie Dixon, and do the ole Kayser in."
"But father, Uncle Joe," protested Millie, "what will he say?"
"'Earty," responded Bindle with conviction, "will say about all the most unpleasant and uncomfortable things wot any man can think of, but you leave him to me." There was a grim note in his voice which caused Charlie Dixon to look at him curiously. "I ain't been your daddy's brother-in-law for 19 years without knowin' 'ow to manage 'im, Millikins," Bindle continued. "Now you be a good gal and go 'ome and ask 'im if you can marry Charlie Dixon at once."
"Oh, but I can't, Uncle Joe," Millie protested. "I simply can't. Father can be—"
She broke off. "Very well then," remarked Bindle resignedly, "the Germans'll beat us." Millie smiled in spite of herself.
I'll try, Uncle Joe," she conceded.
"Now look 'ere, Millikins, you goes 'ome to night and you says to that 'appy 'earted ole dad o' yours, 'Father, I'm goin' to marry Charlie Dixon next Tuesday, or whatever day you fix.' 'E'll say you ain't goin' to do no such thing." Millie nodded her head in agreement. "Well," continued Bindle, "wot you'll say is, 'I won't marry no one else and I'm goin' to marry Charlie Dixon.' Then you jest nips round to Fenton Street and leaves the rest to me. If you two kids ain't married on the day wot you fix on, then I'll eat my 'at. Yes, the one I'm wearin' and the concertina that I got at 'ome. Eat 'em both, I will." Millie and Charlie Dixon looked at Bindle admiringly.
"You are wonderful, Uncle Joe," she said.
Then turning to Charlie Dixon, she asked,
"What should we have done, Charlie, if we hadn't had Uncle Joe?"
Charlie Dixon shook his head. The question was beyond him.
"We shall never be able to thank you, Uncle Joe," said Millie. You'll thank me by bein' just as 'appy as you know 'ow, and if ever you wants to scrap you'll kiss and make it up. Ain't that right, Charlie?" Charlie Dixon nodded his head violently. He was too busily occupied gazing into Millie's eyes to pay much attention to the question asked him. "Oh, you are a darling, Uncle Joe," said Millie. Then with a sigh she added, "I wish I could give every girl an Uncle Joe." "Well, now we must be orf. 'Ere's the band a goin' 'ome, and they'll be puttin' the lights out soon," said Bindle, as Charlie Dixon called for his bill. As they said good night at Earl's Court Station, Charlie Dixon going on to Hammersmith, Millie whispered to him, "It's been such a wonderful evening, Charlie dear." Then rather dreamily she added, "The most wonderful evening I've ever known. Good bye, darling. I'll write to morrow." "And you will, Millie?" enquired Charlie Dixon eagerly. She turned away towards the incoming Putney train, then looking over her shoulder nodded her head shyly and ran forward to join Bindle, who was standing at the entrance of a first class carriage. As she entered the carriage, Bindle stepped back to Charlie Dixon. "You just make all your plans, young feller," he said. "Let me know the day and she'll be there." Charlie Dixon gripped Bindle's hand. Bindle winced and drew up one leg in obvious pain at the heartiness of the young lover's grasp. "There are times, young feller, when I wish I was your enemy," he said as he gazed ruefully at his knuckles. "Your friendship 'urts like 'ell." End of Chapter 13. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com